Fantastic to have you all here. My name is Kerry Sautner, and I'll be kind of your guide today in class. We're going to dive deep into this topic today, and we're going to start off with the pre-colonial period and the Constitution and move all the way through the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments. So lots of amazing stuff to go through today. And if you have any questions as we go through the class, please feel free to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. Both places I'll be looking closely. And I'm so glad I won't be alone today. I'll be with our top scholar, Jeffrey Rosen. So welcome, Jeff. How are you doing?
Good, Kerry. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited. This is one of my favorite classes because it's so fascinating. There's some tragic stories, but also some amazing people that have made our country better. So I can't wait to dive into this. Do you want to welcome all the students and do a little introduction?
Hi, everyone. Great to see you and very much looking forward to our discussion. It's an incredibly important topic and I can't wait to learn with you.
So we're all going to learn together, which is a great slogan from the NCC. We're in it together, we're learning together. So Jeff, some of the big questions around the Constitution and slavery that we kind of formed for this class this week is, we know that slavery was embedded into America's fabric by the time of the ratification of the Constitution, but one of the questions that pops up is, do we think that this affected how long slavery lasted in America and how it ended with a bloody civil war? That's kind of one big framing question. And the second question is what we're going to cover towards the end of class around the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, they end slavery in America and they try to rebuild our nation on a stronger constitutional foundation. So the question that we always grapple with is, do we think that these amendments changed the Constitution so much that it was like a second founding? Like the first founding being behind me, that the second founding was the Reconstruction time period. So there's the two big ideas for the classes today. But would you like to dive in deep and start with the Constitution and look at the structural Constitution?
That sounds great. It's hard to imagine two more significant questions than the ones we're talking about today. The first is essentially, was the Constitution a pro-slavery document or not? And that was one of the fiercest debates at the original convention, and it divided the delegates, and it also divided abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. So there were very strong arguments on both sides of that important question. And then this equally important question, were the Reconstruction amendments, which eliminated slavery and promised all persons equal protection and all citizens equal privileges and immunities, were they a kind of second founding? And that the second question I have more confidence in answering yes to. The Reconstruction amendments were a second founding. Both progressive and conservative scholars, if they don't always use those words, recognize it as an event that perfected the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men and eventually all women with the 19th Amendment are created equal. So I think those are two big questions. Let's dive into the first one. What was the status of slavery at the Constitutional Convention in 1787? And was the Constitution a pro-slavery document or not? Very, very important question. First, a quick backstory. Throughout the colonial period, slavery was not just a Southern phenomenon. Often we think of it as something that was limited to the South, but that's not the case. There were enslaved people in several northern states. In New York, for example, there were many enslaved people. During the 1780s, some northern states began to take steps toward freeing enslaved people. Vermont ended slavery in the 1777 Constitution, which you can find in the Interactive Constitution. A state Supreme Court decision ended slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation bill in 1780, followed by Rhode Island and Connecticut in 1784. These bills gradually freed the children of currently enslaved people in later years. And even Virginia made it easier for slave owners to emancipate their slaves by their wills. But some northern states like New York and New Jersey, which had more enslaved people, were reluctant to act. All told, 25 of the 55 delegates to the convention were slave owners. That's roughly 45%, and slavery was critical to many of their wealth. So you see that it was a complicated picture. not just a North-South phenomenon, and even the northern states that are slowly freeing their enslaved people are doing so gradually, not immediately. Nevertheless, there's enough emancipation at the time of the framing and enough ability of free African Americans to have basic civil rights, and in some cases even to vote, that when Chief Justice Roger Taney in the infamous Dred Scott decision, which we'll be working up to in just a moment, said that at the time of the framing, free African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, he was wrong as a historical matter. He was simply factually incorrect, because there were some northern states that did grant African Americans equal civil rights. Now, in order to understand the debate about whether or not the Constitution was or was not a pro-slavery document, we have to look at the central compromises which seemed to acknowledge the existence of slavery in the original Constitution without explicitly using the words slavery or enslaved people. And that was an important deliberate choice. Why? Because James Madison, the framer of the Constitution, said that the Constitution refused to acknowledge the possibility that there could be property in men. That's an extremely significant statement. Madison wasn't saying that the Constitution was a pro or an anti-slavery document, but he said it refused to acknowledge slavery explicitly. And when Frederick Douglass read those words, when Madison's notes were first released in the 1840s, it changed Douglass's conception of himself as a man and as a citizen. And Douglass, who had believed with the Garrisonians that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, changed his mind when he read Madison's notes and concluded that it was an anti-slavery document. But in order to understand, what the options are, we have to look at the provisions of the Constitution that dealt with slavery. Kerry, am I doing okay here, or should I pause for breath?
I think you're doing great. What I love that kind of intro, kind of wrapping us together and looking at this document. And there's three big sections of the structural Constitution that I know you want to dive into to look at. The word's not in there, the word slavery is not in there, but what are the mentions or the nods to slavery? And so I did give you permission to screen share. So
oh wow,
right
okay.
ahead. Or I can show it myself. It's your choice.
You know what? This is going to be a rare occasion where why don't you do the screen sharing and I'll do the description. And let's okay, go ahead.
So let's start. Would you like to begin with, we can begin with the preamble, or we can dive into the three-fifths clause.
Let's dive into the three-fifths clause. So the three-fifths clause, which is arguably the most important of the three, where did this infamous, hurtful language come from? Well, the US House of Representatives draws districts based on a state's population. The larger the state, the greater the number of districts it gets. The greater the number of districts for each state, the greater the political power. The question in the debate over the three-fifths clause was how to count enslaved people when setting the number of representatives in the US House. James Wilson, the man who wrote the preamble, We the People, who championed popular sovereignty, wrote the original drafts of the clause. He borrowed language from a proposed 1784 amendment to the Articles of Confederation, which counted enslaved people as three-fifths of a person. Pro-slavery Southerners said enslaved people should be a full person, five-fifths. Anti-slavery Northerners said this is hypocritical. How can you treat slaves as full people for purposes of representation, but deny their humanity by treating them as property? Plus, it's not fair. Virginia, you're going to get all of these representatives because of human beings who you're not counting as rights holders. So that is completely hypocritical. And Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry, the founder of gerrymandering, said, how can slaves who are property in the South be counted as persons any more than property in the North? So the convention rejects Southern attempts to count enslaved people as a full person and Northern attempts to exclude them from the count completely. And Roger Sherman of Connecticut, the guy who came through with the Connecticut Compromise, which was the House represents people on the basis of population and the Senate represents the states as states, he secured supports for the three-fifths clause, yet another compromise. And this had a huge impact over time. While delegates didn't spend a lot of time discussing slavery when debating how to elect a president, The result of the 3/5 clause was to increase pro-slavery strength in Congress by counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. And this meant that all the first presidents were Virginians, because the Electoral College gives the South a huge slavery bonus in the Electoral College, as well as in the Supreme Court, because by electing pro-slavery presidents, they were able to appoint justices who also supported slavery. So that is the gist of the argument over the 3/5 clause, and it is extremely important. Kerry, what clause should we do next?
The Fugitive Slave Clause.
Okay, so there's not a lot of debate at the convention about the Fugitive Slave Clause. The language itself was not new. It was mostly taken from the Articles of Confederation and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And delegates unanimously approved the language. It gave slaveholders the power to recapture enslaved people that escaped into the territories. It became hugely important in the early 19th century because enslaved people who escaped to the North, it said they had to be delivered back to their putative owners, their masters in this terrible system of chattel slavery. And the clause also gave Congress the power to enforce the clause by appropriate legislation. So there was a federal law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically required Northerners to return Southern enslaved people to the South. And the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Joseph Story, upheld that law. It was one of the first broad statements by the Supreme Court of sweeping congressional power. So it was a case where being deferential to congressional power favored slave owning interest. I can't resist noting here, there's an amazing book by Robert Cover called Justice Accused. And it talks about the dilemma of judges, especially in the North and in Massachusetts, who were required to adjudicate cases under the Fugitive Slave Clause, especially when they opposed slavery as a moral matter. So they had three options. First, they could refuse to enforce the law, which required the return of enslaved people on the grounds that they believed slavery was a moral violation. But that would be a kind of civil disobedience because they'd be refusing to enforce a clearly constitutionally authorized law. They could require the enslaved people to be returned, which violated their conscience. Or there was a third option, they could simply resign from the bench, thinking, I can't in good conscience enforce this law that I believe to be immoral, but I also think it's my judge not to engage in civil disobedience, therefore I'll resign. Justice Amy Coney Barrett said something similar, I believe, when she talked about a judge who thought that he or she could not in good conscience enforce the death penalty. The options are either to refuse to sit on death penalty cases if you think the death penalty violates natural laws, some Catholic people do. So you could refuse to sit on the case, or you could resign from the bench. Fascinating book, Robert Cover, Justice Accused, really, really interesting.
Jeff, you reminded me of one of the saddest but hugely impactful story of Anthony Burns from Boston. And that was one of those cases. The Fugitive Slave Act brought the case to Boston, and the judges did not want to turn him loose. They followed the law. They turned him loose. 50,000 Bostonians watched Anthony Burns, who had been living there for over 20 years and a part of the community, being taken out of Boston and put on a ship to be brought back to Virginia to be re-enslaved. And I cannot remember the author. I'm going to blank on his name, but the line is basically, we went to bed like grouchy Bostonians. We woke up ardent abolitionists. And it blew up the community against this rage when they knew the person and they could connect the dots between slavery. It wasn't just something far away anymore. It was in their faces. So that's a moving story around the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Act.
That's such a powerful story. And it's a really important reminder that Northern opinion about slavery was changed by galvanizing national events like that. At the beginning of the Civil War, the North was divided about slavery, and many of the Northerners who went off to fight in the Union Army were fighting to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the future great Supreme Court justice, was part of a Massachusetts regiment where most of the members were fighting to preserve the Union. Many were, we'd have to call them racist. I mean, they were not fighting to end slavery. But things changed as galvanizing events like that seized Northern imagination. One of the most important things in changing the opinion of the North when in the civil rights movement in the 1960s was those searing photographs of police dogs in Alabama being set on protesters. Maybe some of you have seen them. Remember the fire hoses and the police dogs? And those were so shocking that Northerners who hadn't really been paying much attention before suddenly think, okay, this is a moral issue. And the same thing happened throughout the early 19th century with stories like Anthony Burns, as Kerry said, or cases of, they were called the Negro seamen, these sailors, free African-American sailors, who would stop in Southern ports and were denied the right to read, were to buy abolitionist literature, were degraded, were denied basic civil rights that they would have enjoyed in Boston. And those who went to defend these Negro seamen, these African-American freed blacks who were like put in prison just because they stopped in Southern ports, were abused. And this also really changed Northern opinion too. So you can't underestimate the importance of concrete cases that actually make injustice real to people. And that's exactly what was going on here. All right, Kerry, is it time for the Dred Scott decision?
Real quick, slave trade clause, and then yes, Dred Scott. And I'd like to talk about Harriet Scott a lot.
Okay, so the slave trade clause is crucial. Article 1, Section 9, Congress is limited expressly from prohibiting the importation of enslaved people before 1808. So by the founding, even many slaveholders opposed the inhumane Atlantic slave trade, and they said, okay, we understand that bringing more enslaved people is going to have to stop at some point, although we certainly want to keep our enslaved people who are crucial, who are already in the United States, but they weren't ready to end the slave trade immediately, so the clause protected this brutal slave trade until 1808. After that point, Congress had the power to abolish it, and in fact it did. In 1808, it did abolish the international slave trade. So considering all of these provisions together, you can understand the range of voices, both pro and anti-slavery, turned this language and constructed arguments to frame their case about whether or not it was a pro-slavery document. So, I mean, that helps us approach the Dred Scott case in 1857, and we can see that there are arguments on both sides of whether or not the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. On the one hand, pro-slavery advocates like John C. Calhoun, the most notorious defender of the constitutionality of slavery, unquestionably argued the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. They said provisions like the 3/5 Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause made clear that the Constitution was designed to protect Southern slaveholders' rights to hold their slaves as property, what they referred to as a right to property in man, the very language that James Madison refused to insert in the Constitution. And they argued that the slaveholding states would never have agreed to the Constitution if they hadn't been able to strike the bargain. And then they became even more aggressive, saying not just that the Constitution didn't only protect slavery in the existing slaveholding states, but that they denied Congress the power to ban slavery elsewhere, including in the territories. And now we're leading up to the Dred Scott decision. It's a more aggressive case to say the existing slaveholding states have their slavery protected. It's the pro-slavery side through Calhoun went beyond that to say Congress can't even ban slavery in the newly admitted federal territories. And that was the central question in Dred Scott. Abolitionists were divided about whether or not it was a pro-slavery document. Some, like the Garrisonians, after William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the so-called radical abolitionists, one of the most principled advocates of abolition, said the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And Garrison, in that sense, agreed with the pro-slavery advocates that the Constitution was a pro-slavery compact. They burned the Constitution. They opposed involvement of political parties, saying the only way to end slavery is through moral persuasion and activism. Other anti-slavery advocates disagreed. Those like Lysander Spooner, Lysander, Lysander Spooner, what a great name, rejected the Garrisonian argument and countered, but that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. And that was the position that Frederick Douglass eventually embraced. He began as a Garrisonian, but later changed his mind, influenced by anti-slavery voices like Spooner. And in 1860, Douglass read the Constitution's text as a glorious liberty document. It was a textualist speech. He reasoned the Constitution doesn't mention the word slavery. He said future generations shouldn't search the history for secret motives or dishonest intentions. He said the Fugitive Slave Clause doesn't explicitly apply to slaves, but to laborers. He read the 3/5 Clause as opening the door to freedom by recognizing the humanity of enslaved people. He read the Constitution's preamble as bending toward freedom, not slavery. And he said that the Due Process Clause should be read to support the claims of slaves, not slave holders, as it protects the property rights of enslaved people in their own language. Douglass said, its language is we the people, not we the white people, not even we the citizens, not we the privileged class, not we the high, not we the low, but we the people. And Douglass concluded, if the South has made the Constitution bend to the purpose of slavery, let the North now make that instrument bend to the cause of freedom and justice. So galvanizing, so inspiring. Friends, please study and be inspired by the life of Frederick Douglass. We did such a great podcast last July 4th on Douglass's famous speech, What to a Slave is the 4th of July, with the great Douglass biographer, David Blight of Yale University. His biography of Frederick Douglass is a wonderful place to begin. If you want some Jeff work for this week, that means reading for fun and just for the pure pleasure of learning. The podcast is really great too.
I'll send you guys the podcast, and one of our actors at the Constitution Center read the speech, so I can send you that as well. I'll send you the speech so you can read it and listen to it. So Sarah had a great question in the Q&A, and she's and it was really about Calhoun's point, and said, but what about the Northwest Ordinance? Does that not give Congress the ability to regulate enslavement in those territories?
Well, that's a very good argument. Since the language of the 3/5 Clause was taken from the Northwest Ordinance, and since the ordinance did seem to anticipate that sort of congressional power, that was a strong argument for the Douglass-like position. It was 1787, and it was adopted by the Confederation Congress. So you could say it was before the Constitution itself was adopted, but it's a very strong argument. And that, Sarah, really was the crucial question leading up to Dred Scott. What was Congress's power to ban slavery in the Northwest Territories? Samuel Chase, the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice appointed by Abraham Lincoln, had a great slogan, Freedom National, Slavery Local. The group led by Salmon Chase said that while the Constitution didn't empower the national government to interfere with slavery where it already existed in the slaveholding states, the federal government is free to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, in the territories, and on all federal installations. These were known as the political abolitionists because they were willing to engage in electoral politics to achieve the end of slavery. Freedom National, Slavery Local. They wanted to limit the spread and influence of slavery in the hopes it might eventually die out without war. This eventually became the constitutional platform of the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and eventually the Republican Party. Unfortunately, this position, Freedom National, Slavery Local, was ruled unconstitutional in the infamous Dred Scott decision. So you have a series of complicated position. You have some Southern Democrats who take the extreme Calhoun position that Congress has no power to ban slavery wherever it exists, and even in the territories, because the property of slave owners is protected by the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment that rules out of debate the position of the Republican Party. You also have the Stephen Douglas Democrats who agree that each territory or state can decide for itself whether or not to ban or accept slavery. And then you have, and in that sense, they're uniting with the position of the newly formed Republican Party. And then you have the radical abolitionists who argue that slavery itself is a violation of natural law and of the Due Process Clause. So this is a really important constitutional point. let's step back for a sec. Dred Scott is widely viewed as one of the most infamous, the worst Supreme Court decisions of all times. It's viewed as an example of great judicial activism because the court reached out to decide a question that it wasn't required to decide in order to resolve the case. It could have ruled much more narrowly, either for or against Dred Scott and his claim to have been freed when his master took him into Fort Snelling, which was federal territory where slavery didn't exist. He said as soon as he went into the federal territory, he was freed. The court could have ruled narrowly that your status as an enslaved person is determined either by the place of your domicile, and it doesn't change when you travel, or it could have agreed with Dred Scott that he was freed when he went to Fort Snelling. Either position, obviously the outcome is extremely important for Dred Scott and his claims for freedom, but they don't have broader national implications. But Chief Justice Roger Taney went much further than that. And in the infamous Dred Scott decision, he held that the Missouri Compromise, which Congress had passed decades before to ban slavery north of the 39th parallel, itself was unconstitutional because it deprived slave owners of their property rights without due process of law. This was problematic on many levels. First, as a constitutional matter, it's an example of what's called substantive due process. Now that sounds really technical, but when you think of the language of the Fifth Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that seems to suggest that if there is due process of law, you can deprive people of life, liberty, or property. And due process usually means that you go into a court and you have a jury hear your case. To say that there are certain rights, in this case, property rights in enslaved people, that are so fundamental that they can't be deprived even with due process, that's what's called substantive due process, and it's counterintuitive. It doesn't seem to be supported by the text. That's why the constitutional scholar John Hart Ely called it an oxymoron, like green pastel redness. Sounds weird. How can something be green and red and pastel at the same time? How can something be substantive and procedural at the same time? So the claim is that it was bad constitutional law because it can't be reconciled with the text. It was also judicial activism in the sense that the case could have been resolved more narrowly. And an amazing, we're having very dramatic times right now. Imagine this: James Buchanan, the outgoing president, the Democratic president, who's viewed as one of the worst presidents in American history, gets advance word from Chief Justice Roger Taney that the court is about to strike down the Dred Scott decision. Taney and Buchanan speak at Buchanan's inaugural address. And in his inaugural address, Buchanan says essentially, don't worry, the Supreme Court's about to settle this question. You're going to hear good news. Can you imagine? It's like a tip-off from the Supreme Court that Taney says he's about to rule for, the Democratic position. Taney believed that he was saving the country. He thought he was doing a great thing, even though he was enacting a hotly contested constitutional position that he himself had embraced as Andrew Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury. He thought that the court was taking one on the chin. It was a tough decision, but it would spare the country this divisive political debate. How wrong he was. And although Dred Scott may not have actually precipitated the Civil War, as some claim, there's no doubt that it helped to continue to fan the flames that led to the Civil War. And therefore, Dred Scott is seen by both Democrats and Republicans today as an example of a decision that, through unnecessarily reaching out to decide constitutional questions, ended up creating a political backlash of historic proportions. Kerry, why don't you tell the story of Harriet Scott, because it's such a great story.
Harriet Scott's one of my favorite, and it's a fascinating kind of look at it. So Harriet Scott, an enslaved mother, she has two young girls, and she is in free territory, and the worry that her family is going to be enslaved again and not have their freedom, and that watch her daughters go through that experience, is her and another woman say, we are going to take this up, and they bring it to the courts first. Dred Scott then also petitions alongside of it, and they use Dred Scott's position, because he's a male, as the kind of the lead in this. So this, what I love about this is people with very, very limited resources, people with the law against them, know what's valuable in our country and know what's right, and they fight for it, and they take their freedom on, they take their power on, and they move it forward. They had so many court cases. Jeff, it takes about 11 years to go to the Supreme Court, correct?
In that case, I think that's right. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, 11 years. And so the resources around this dwindle and dwindle. The abolition movement is trying to raise money for them, to support them, but it's still unbelievable. And almost no lawyer will take their case. They do wind up with one of the best lawyers, and he takes the case for free because he says, we're doing this because this is what's right and this is what our country believes in. So the reason why it's a terrible outcome, it's a terrible action by the Supreme Court. But what we see in this case is this explosion of, what do we believe in our country? And it really does kind of take that cindering smolder of civil war or of slavery in our country and blows it up. And then we get the Civil War. And then out of the Civil War, we get 3 huge amendments. And Jeff, to wrap up the class, I'd love for you to walk us through the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, because these are what fix the wrongs of slavery and fix the Dred Scott decision and Taney's words.
Absolutely. And of course, we're going to spend all of next week on the 14th Amendment. I teach an entire class essentially on the 14th Amendment. All of our most hotly contested modern questions arise under the 14th and 15th Amendments. So right now, we're just going to note, I think this is what we should do to wrap up. The Dred Scott is the most overturned Supreme Court decision in history. It's overturned by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in multiple ways. So let's quickly figure out how those amendments did that. Begin with the 13th. Thank you, Kerry. Before we do that, Colin asks, how did Lincoln have the authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation if he didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy? Great question, Colin, which sets up our discussion of the 13th Amendment. Lincoln thought he only had the power to ban slavery either in federal territories or in areas that were militarily controlled by the North. He did not believe that he had the power to ban slavery first of all, in parts of the North where it was recognized, including the District of Columbia, or in southern states that were not in active rebellion against the United States. So because he thought he was such a good lawyer, he thought his authority was limited to his military authority as commander-in-chief, he believed that a 13th Amendment, a constitutional amendment, was necessary after the Emancipation Proclamation to extend the ban on slavery everywhere throughout the entire United States, not just to the areas that the North militarily controlled. So great question, Colin. So then the 13th does exactly that. Lincoln doesn't live to see it ratified, although you may know from the Lincoln movie that the debate begins, when he's before his assassination. And it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. So that overturns the part of the Dred Scott decision that says that slavery is constitutionally protected and cannot be disturbed under any circumstance. Colin also asks about that criminal exception clause. And we should note that it was used to justify convict labor. And it was essentially drawn from the Northwest Ordinance as well, back to Sarah's question, familiar language borrowed from many constitution and laws. Eric Foner explains the effect of this provision. He says, despite the 13th Amendment, involuntary Black labor, justified by the criminal exception, was central to these laws. They required all adult Black men at the beginning of each year to sign a labor contract to work for a white employer or face prosecution for vagrancy or other vaguely defined crimes. Those convicted would be fined and, if unable to pay, forced to labor for a white employer. It was slavery by another name, and it was one of the many examples by which the southern states attempted to reimpose slavery by another name. And those other means included the infamous Black Codes, which denied free African Americans the right to make or enforce contracts, to sue or be sued, and to exercise the privileges and immunities of citizenship. Congress tried to respond to these black codes by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would have guaranteed to all persons in the United States equal protection of the law, and also to all citizens equal privileges or immunities. But Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act. Congress repassed the law over his veto, but there was question about whether it had the constitutional authority to pass the Civil Rights Act. Was there the power in the original Congress that allowed Congress to guarantee equal civil rights? Some in Congress said, don't worry, we don't need to pass a constitutional amendment. Republicans will have the majority forever, so we can just pass the Civil Rights Act and no one's going to challenge us. Others, like John Bingham and Thaddeus Stevens, properly said, we better be safe than sorry. We might lose our majority. We better pass an amendment to ensure that Congress has the power to pass this act. And that's why Bingham's first draft of the 14th Amendment said, Congress shall have the power to protect all persons in their equal rights of life, liberty, and property. It was really phrased in terms of congressional power. At this point, I would love so much, I'm just itching to screen share and show the drafting table of the interactive Constitution, but I think we don't.
We don't have a lot of time, and there's three
Yeah.
more questions I want to ask you from Mrs. Santana's class. So
that's great. Well, that's the that's the gist of it. I mean, we'll spend a lot of time on the 14th Amendment next week. We'll run through each of the clauses and see how all of them overturn the Dred Scott decision. The first sentence says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Boom, repudiating Taney's claim that you could be an African American and not have any rights. Now everyone born in the United States has full rights of citizens, and so it goes on. And then finally, the 15th Amendment gives African American men political rights, although that ends up being subverted in troubling ways. So that is the Civil War amendments. They were indeed a second founding or a second reconstruction of American liberty, fulfilling the promise of the Declaration. And that is the answer to our second big question.
Awesome. And so 4 really quick questions. In current society, this is from Natalie Santana's class. So in current society, what are the activities that people participate in that can push the boundaries of slavery laws? I know I instantly was thinking about the housing in the 1950s and the 1930s. The badge, I know when we talk about the 13th Amendment, we talk a badge of slavery, and they looked at the housing and zoning locations of building housing was one of them. But Jeff, can you think of any other ones that maybe more recent?
I think you're right, Kerry, and this question, which arose in the Jones and Meyer case about whether or not Congress had whether the 13th Amendment might authorize the banning of private discrimination, whether you need a state action requirement in order to forbid the badge as an instance of slavery, or whether private choices like zoning laws might be challenged under the 13th Amendment, was raised by this Jones case. And those cases might become relevant again. This current Supreme Court is not very sympathetic to those arguments, so I wouldn't expect it to get a lot of traction on the Supreme Court. But there are very powerful arguments that the badges and incidents of slavery should include not only slavery itself, but discriminatory private choices. And those are the kind of ones that are raised by that question.
Next question. Do you think that one of the reasons the South were so against ratifying slavery was because of the economic impact, or I think they meant letting go of slavery, was the economic impact of the South would have on itself? Maybe it wasn't just about morality, but maybe it was about economy too.
A very complicated question, but there's no doubt that economics were a huge part of it. And Jefferson and others said as much. They said that the entire economy of the South turned on this infamous institution, and the Southern states just believed that they could not afford to give it up. So it was absolutely a factor.
Next question is, who proposed the 3/5 clause, and how did it come about? How did they get to that fact? Like, do you know why they compromised on 3 instead of 2 or 4/5?
Yes. So the 3/5 language came from the from the Northwest Ordinance as well, and or from the contemporaneous law. Let me just go back and find it. But it was Roger Sherman who proposed it. He was the guy who did the compromise, and the language itself. I had it before. It's gonna take
The 13th Amendment came from the Northwest Ordinance as well, correct? Am I remembering that?
the criminal exception language came from the Northwest Ordinance, and the clause, the 3/5 clause itself, came from a proposed 1784 amendment to the Articles of Confederation. That was where it came from, and which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. Sorry, James Wilson wrote the original draft. Roger Morris governed the compromise that allowed it to pass.
Got it. And last question is, and I don't know if you know this answer, so this is a tricky, hard one for the last one. How was life like for freed enslaved people after the Civil War?
Well, it was dreadful. It was because the Southern states tried to reimpose slavery by another name. That was the indignity of the criminal exception clause with those forced labor contracts, and also the Black Codes, which, imagine having fought the bloodiest war in American history. African Americans fought heroically in this war. They're promised freedom by these amendments, and then they're denied all the rights they're promised by these disgraceful laws. So it was extremely hard. And we have this very moving exhibit at the Constitution Center about the Civil War and Reconstruction, which both tells how much hope there was on Juneteenth, June 13th, and with the end of the Civil War, but also how much disappointment when the reality sunk in about rights being denied. So, but nevertheless, it's both a heroic struggle of triumph and tragedies, to trite a way to describe the agonizing oscillations of liberty and equality promised and then thwarted. But the arc did bend upward. The amendments were passed. They were then thwarted by the Supreme Court, which construed them out of existence in ways we'll talk about. They were thwarted politically by redemption, as Professor Henry Louis Gates calls it, the infamous backlash to Reconstruction, which again thwarted the promise of the amendments. But the struggle continued, and the Civil War exhibit at the Constitution Center ends with Martin Luther King on the Mall in Washington during the march, invoking the language of the Declaration of Independence. His dream is that all human beings are created equal, and then that promise will become a reality. It's so incredibly moving. And let's end today by being inspired by King's promise and his faith, and King's faith, that the arc of progress bends upward.
Thank you, Jeff. And I just want to remind all of our students that on Friday at 1 o'clock, we're going to go through the exhibit. So we thought it would be a great way to tell this story, is to look at the actual artifacts and primary sources and the words from the people that have lived through this time period. So that's a great way to end on, and we'll end on that video that we have in the exhibit of Martin Luther King talking about the Arc of Freedom. So what a great way to end this Monday. Thank you for this deep dive into this difficult but such an important topic for us to talk about. And students, your questions were rocking today, so nice job. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, students. See you next time in class.
Thank you, Kerry. See you soon.